The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds the same way it had for 37 years, cutting golden strips across the oak table where Margaret and I used to share our coffee. I sat alone now, same chair, same blue ceramic mug with a tiny chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she'd say, running her thumb over the imperfection like she did with everything broken that still had use left in it. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain and looked out at Clear Creek Lake. The water was mirror still, reflecting the October sky like polished steel. Margaret had chosen this house 32 years ago, walking through rooms that smelled of sawdust and possibility. "This is where we'll grow old together," she'd announced, as if the decision had been made by something larger than either of us. She'd been right, of course. We had grown old here. I just hadn't expected to finish the job alone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note echoing through rooms that felt too large for one person. I'd built most of the furniture myself, back when my hands were steadier and my back didn't remind me of every ladder I'd climbed, every beam I'd lifted, the dining room table where we'd hosted Christmas dinners, the built-in bookshelves where Margaret arranged her mysteries and gardening magazines in perfect rows, the bay window seat where she'd curl up with her knitting, needles clicking in rhythm with the rain. Everything here carried her fingerprints, her choices, her laughter. Even 2 years after the funeral, I sometimes caught myself setting 2 cups on the counter before remembering. The mail slot rattled, and I heard the familiar thud of letters hitting the hardwood floor. I padded to the front door in my slippers, the same worn leather ones Margaret bought me for my 60th birthday. The pile was small, a utility bill, grocery store circulars, and a thick cream envelope with my name written in careful script. The handwriting made me pause, not because I didn't recognize it, but because I did. David's penmanship had always been precise, deliberate, the product of a mother who'd made him practice cursive until his letters looked like they belonged in a copybook. But this felt different somehow, more formal. The return address was his law office in Portland, not his home. I carried the envelope back to the kitchen and set it beside my coffee cup. David rarely wrote letters anymore. Everything was texts and emails and those video calls where he looked distracted, eyes darting to his computer screen while we talked about the weather and his work. When had we stopped having real conversations? When had, "How are you, Dad?" become something he said the way people ask about your health at the grocery store, polite but not really wanting details? The envelope was heavier than it should have been for a simple letter. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out not one sheet, but several. The top page was typed on law firm letterhead, formal and cold. The second was handwritten, and the third looked like some kind of official document with raised seals and signatures. I read the typed letter first. It was addressed to someone named Marcus Chen, apparently another attorney. The language was dense with legal terminology, but certain phrases jumped out like neon signs in fog. Transfer of property ownership, elderly parents' diminished capacity, power of attorney proceedings, and expedited probate. My hand holding the paper began to tremble, not from age but from understanding. This wasn't a letter to me at all. It was a copy of correspondence about me, about my house, about my mental state, about treating me like I was already gone. The handwritten note was worse. David's neat script laid out a timeline, a strategy, how to approach conversations with me, which family members to involve, how to present the assisted living option as if it were for my own good, how to handle my inevitable resistance to giving up the house. "Dad's becoming more forgetful," one line read. "Yesterday he called me Danny twice, which was my childhood nickname. Clear signs of confusion. The house is too much for him now, and he's too proud to admit it." I set the papers down and stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. The man looking back had gray hair and lines around his eyes, but his mind was sharp as the day Margaret died. I'd called David Danny because that's what I'd called him when he was 7 years old, and we'd spent a whole Saturday rebuilding the engine of my old Chevelle together. It had been a moment of tenderness, a memory surfacing in the middle of an ordinary phone conversation. Not confusion, connection, but he'd twisted it into evidence. The third document was the most damning, a petition for guardianship, already partially filled out, waiting only for signatures and a court date. My son, My only child, the boy I'd taught to fish and drive and tie his shoes, had drafted legal papers to have me declared incompetent. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by 37 years of careful living, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart, though that ached too. Something deeper. The foundation of trust that holds a family together. The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed David's number. "Hi, Dad." His voice was warm, casual, the same tone he'd used as a teenager when he wanted to borrow the car. "How are you feeling today?" How was I feeling? Like my son had just driven a knife between my shoulder blades. Like the past 67 years of my life had been reduced to bullet points in a legal strategy. "I'm fine, Danny," I said, using the nickname deliberately. "Just fine." "Good, good. Listen, I was thinking maybe we should have dinner this weekend. Sarah's been asking about you." Sarah, his wife of 8 years, who'd never shown the slightest interest in my well-being before, who looked at our family photos like she was studying evidence of a crime she didn't understand. "That sounds nice," I lied. "Should I come up there or—" "Actually, we thought we'd come to you. Sarah's parents are visiting from California, and they'd love to see the lake house. It's been too long since we've all been together. The lake house, our family retreat, the place where David had learned to swim, where Margaret and I had celebrated our 20th anniversary, where we'd scattered her ashes from the dock last spring. Of course they wanted to see it. They wanted to evaluate it, to walk through rooms and calculate square footage and market value. Of course, I said. I'll make a roast. Perfect. We'll be there Saturday around 5. And Dad, maybe we can talk about some things, about the future." The future. My future, apparently, which they had already planned without consulting me. After I hung up, I walked through the house with new eyes. The living room where Margaret and I had watched the evening news for 3 decades. The master bedroom where I still slept on my side of the bed, leaving her pillow undisturbed. The spare room that had been David's until he left for college and never really came back. In my study, I opened the safe where we kept our important papers, birth certificates, insurance policies, the deed to the house with both our names on it until Margaret's death. Now just mine. I pulled out my will, the one David knew about, the one that left everything to him because he was my only child, and I'd believe that's what parents did. But sitting there in my leather chair, holding legal documents that proved my son saw me as an obstacle rather than a father, I began to think differently. Margaret had always said I was too trusting, too willing to assume the best in people. "Sometimes, William," she'd tell me, "you have to protect yourself from the people who should be protecting you." I'd never understood what she meant until now. The afternoon sun slanted through the study windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug Margaret had chosen for our 10th anniversary. I could almost hear her voice, sharp with the kind of practical wisdom that had guided our marriage through 4 decades of joys and sorrows. "What would you do?" I whispered to the empty room. The silence that answered was louder than any response could have been. Margaret wasn't here to fix this. I was 73 years old, a widower living alone in a house too big for one person. And my son was treating me like a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. But I wasn't the confused, declining old man David had described in his letter. My mind was clear, my memories intact, and my determination solid as the oak beams I'd used to frame this house. If David wanted to play legal games with my future, he was about to learn that his old man still had a few moves left. I folded the papers carefully and put them back in their envelope. Then I reached for the phone book. Yes, I still kept one, despite David's eye rolling about my old-fashioned ways, and looked up the number for Marcus Chen, attorney at law. If my son wanted to involve lawyers in our family business, I'd be happy to oblige him, but this conversation was going to go very differently than he expected. Saturday was 4 days away. That gave me time to prepare, time to think, time to plan. I looked at the photograph of Margaret on my desk, her smile as warm and encouraging as it had been the day I took it, and made her a promise. "I won't go quietly, sweetheart. Our boy needs to learn that respect isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn." The grandfather clock chimed again, marking another hour in a life I was about to fight to keep. Outside, the lake reflected the changing light, constant and patient, the way some things endure despite the storms that try to reshape them. I had 4 days to become the father my son had forgotten I could be. 4 days to remind him that wisdom and love weren't signs of weakness, and that a man doesn't become invisible just because he's grieving. 4 days to save my family from the very people who were supposed to protect it. The envelope sat on my desk, like a declaration of war I hadn't asked for, but was fully prepared to fight. Comment yes. If you want to see more similar stories, Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made the lake look like a postcard. I'd been awake since 5, not from anxiety, but from the methodical preparation that came with 40 years of managing construction projects. When you know a difficult conversation is coming, you prepare the same way you'd prepare for pouring a foundation. Measure twice, cut once, and make sure you have all your materials ready. The roast had been in the oven since noon, filling the house with the smell of rosemary and garlic. I'd set the dining room table with Margaret's good china, the set we'd received as a wedding gift, and used only for special occasions. Today felt special, though not in the way David expected. Marcus Chen had been exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd called him Monday morning. Calm, thorough, and utterly unsurprised by my situation. "Mr. Williams," he'd said in his quiet voice, "unfortunately, what you're describing isn't uncommon. Adult children sometimes lose sight of the difference between caring for a parent and controlling them." We'd met Tuesday afternoon in his downtown office, a modest space that smelled of leather and old books. I'd brought the envelope, and he'd read through David's correspondence with the kind of professional detachment that made me grateful I was paying for his expertise rather than his sympathy. "Your son has done his homework," Marcus had admitted, "but he's made some assumptions that may not hold up to scrutiny. The good news is that you've come to me before any formal proceedings have begun. We have options." Options. I liked the sound of that word. Now, as I straightened the already perfect place settings, I thought about the manila folder tucked into my desk drawer. Marcus had worked quickly, and the documents inside would give David something to think about. But first, I wanted to see how far he was willing to go with his charade of concern. At 5 o'clock sharp, I heard tires on the gravel driveway. Through the front window, I watched David's silver BMW pull up beside my old Ford pickup. The contrast wasn't lost on me. His car probably cost more than I'd made in my best year running Williams Construction, back when I still had contracts and employees and a future that included working until I chose to stop. David emerged first, looking like he'd stepped out of a law firm brochure. Charcoal suit, expensive haircut, the kind of polished appearance that Margaret used to say, made him look like a stranger wearing our son's face. Behind him came Sarah, blonde and immaculate in a way that suggested she'd never experienced a day of actual inconvenience. Her parents followed, Robert and Patricia Blackwell, whom I'd met exactly twice before, and remembered mainly for their habit of speaking about me as if I weren't in the room. The final passenger surprised me, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a professional smile, carrying a leather portfolio. I didn't recognize her, but something about her bearing suggested she wasn't here for the social aspects of our dinner. "Dad!" David's greeting was too loud, too enthusiastic, the kind of performance you put on when you have an audience to convince. He hugged me with the careful attention of someone checking for frailty. "You look great, really great." "I feel great," I said, meaning it more than he could know. "Come in, all of you. The roast should be ready in about 20 minutes. Sarah kissed my cheek with lips that barely made contact. "William, the house looks wonderful, so cozy." Cozy was real estate speak for small, outdated, the kind of place that would look much better after some strategic renovations, or demolition. Robert Blackwell shook my hand with the firm grip of a man who'd learned to signal authority through physical contact. "Bill, good to see you. This is quite a spread you've got here." His eyes were already cataloging. The original hardwood floors, the stone fireplace I'd built by hand, the picture windows that faced the lake. Patricia smiled with the kind of warmth that never reached the eyes. "Such a lovely property, so peaceful. I can see why you're reluctant to leave it. Leave it, not why you love it here, or why you chose to stay. Leave it, as if my departure were already a foregone conclusion." The unknown woman stepped forward. "Mr. Williams, I'm Dr. Amanda Foster. I specialize in geriatric transitions. David thought it might be helpful if I joined you this evening." Geriatric transitions. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. They'd brought a professional? This wasn't just a family dinner, it was an intervention. "How thoughtful," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building behind my ribs. "Please, everyone make yourselves comfortable. I'll check on dinner." In the kitchen, I stood with my hands flat against the counter, breathing slowly. Through the doorway, I could hear them murmuring in the living room, their voices low and conspiratorial. Sarah was already taking photos with her phone. For the family album, no doubt, though I suspected they'd end up in a real estate listing soon enough. When I returned with a tray of appetizers, Dr. Foster was sitting in Margaret's chair, making notes in a small tablet. The sight of a stranger occupying my wife's seat, evaluating my home like a specimen under a microscope, made my jaw clench. "Dad," David said, accepting a small plate, "Dr. Foster was just telling us about some wonderful communities for active seniors, places where you could have your own space, but also access to help when you need it." "I don't need help," I said quietly. "Well, of course not now," Sarah interjected with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "But it's smart to plan ahead, especially living all the way out here, so far from medical facilities. 23 miles to the nearest hospital. I'd driven that route twice a week for 6 months when Margaret was getting her chemotherapy. I knew every curve, every traffic light, every shortcut. Far from medical facilities, my ass." Dr. Foster leaned forward with practiced concern. "Mr. Williams, David mentioned that you've been experiencing some memory difficulties. Small things, but worth monitoring." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, this attorney who made his living with words and knew exactly how much power they carried. Did he mention specifically what kind of memory difficulties? David's color deepened slightly. "Just little things, Dad, like when you called me Danny last week, and sometimes you seem confused about dates." "I called you Danny," I said slowly, "because that's what I called you when you were 7 years old and helped me rebuild the Chevelle engine. It was a good memory, a happy memory, not confusion." The room went quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock. Dr. Foster made another note. "As for dates," I continued, "today is Saturday, October 14th. Yesterday was Friday the 13th, which I remember because your mother always said it was bad luck to schedule anything important on Friday the 13th. She died on a Friday the 13th 2 years ago, next month. So I tend to notice those dates." Patricia cleared her throat. "William, no one's questioning your mental acuity. We're just concerned about practical matters. This house is quite large for one person to maintain." "I built this house," I said. "I know every beam, every wire, every pipe. I know which window sticks in the summer and which faucet drips when the pressure drops. Maintaining it isn't a burden, it's a relationship." Robert leaned forward, and I could see the negotiator in him taking over. "But surely you can see that it makes financial sense to consider alternatives. The property values around the lake have increased significantly. You could sell this place and buy something more manageable, maybe even have money left over for travel, for enjoying your retirement." There it was, the real agenda, wrapped in concern and tied with a bow of financial logic. They wanted me to sell the house, to turn 37 years of memories into a number in a bank account that would be much easier to manage when the time came. "And where exactly would I go?" I asked. Dr. Foster consulted her tablet again. "There are several excellent facilities in the area. Sunrise Manor, for example, offers independent living apartments with optional meal service and housekeeping. Very dignified, very comfortable." Sunrise Manor. I knew the place. A collection of beige buildings where old people went to wait for death, playing bingo and complaining about the food, while their families visited on weekends with forced cheerfulness and barely concealed relief. "David," I said, turning to my son, "is this what you want? For me to move to Sunrise Manor?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Dad, I want you to be safe and happy, and I worry about you out here alone. What if something happens? What if you fall or have another episode with your blood pressure?" Another episode. I'd had one incident 18 months ago, a brief spike that landed me in the emergency room for 6 hours of observation and a prescription for medication I took religiously. But in David's narrative, it had become a pattern of declining health. "I see," I said, "and this concern for my safety, this worry about my well-being. When exactly did it begin?" The question hung in the air like smoke, Sarah and her parents suddenly found their appetizers fascinating. Dr. Foster continued taking notes. David opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Dad, it's not like there was a specific moment. It's just, you're getting older. We all are. And after losing Mom, he trailed off, perhaps realizing that using Margaret's death as justification for uprooting my life wasn't the compassionate angle he'd hoped for. I stood up slowly, deliberately. Excuse me for a moment. I need to check on the roast. In the kitchen, I pulled the manila folder from my desk drawer and set it on the counter next to the stove. Inside were copies of the documents Marcus had prepared, along with my own surprise contribution. A letter I'd written the night before, addressed to David but copied to everyone who mattered. When I returned to the living room, the conversation stopped abruptly. They'd been talking about me, planning their next move in my absence. The roast needs another 15 minutes, I announced, which gives us time to discuss something important. I placed the manila folder on the coffee table, right next to Dr. Foster's tablet. David, I received an interesting piece of mail this week. I think you'll find it familiar. His face went pale as I pulled out the envelope containing his correspondence with Marcus Chen, his original Marcus Chen, not mine. The letter outlining his strategy for having me declared incompetent, the timeline for probate proceedings, the guardianship petition. Dad, I can explain. Please do, I said quietly. Explain to me how a son who claims to love his father sends a letter describing that father as confused and declining. Explain to me how concern for my welfare includes planning legal proceedings behind my back. Explain to me how you justify bringing a stranger into my home to evaluate me like a piece of furniture you're trying to get rid of. Dr. Foster had stopped taking notes. Sarah stared at her hands. Patricia and Robert looked like they wanted to disappear into the sofa cushions, but David, to his credit, didn't deny it. I was protecting you, he said finally, from yourself, if necessary. Dad, you're not thinking clearly about your future. Someone has to. Someone, I repeated. Not my son, someone, as if I were already gone, and you were just managing the estate. I opened my folder and pulled out the first document. Well, since you're so concerned about my future, let me share what I've done to secure it. The paper I handed him was a new will, signed and notarized 3 days ago. David's face went through several colors as he read it. You've left everything to the Veterans Rehabilitation Foundation, he said, his voice hollow. Not everything, I corrected. Just the house and property. The foundation plans to turn it into a retreat center for wounded veterans. Men and women who've served their country and need a place to heal. They'll appreciate what this place represents. Sarah found her voice first. You can't be serious. This is your family home, David's inheritance. Inheritance, I said, is something you earn through love and loyalty, not something you claim through legal maneuvering. I pulled out the second document. This is a healthcare directive, naming Marcus Chen as my advocate should I become unable to make medical decisions. And this, I handed over the third paper, is a revocable trust that places all my financial assets under professional management. Essentially, David, I've made it legally impossible for you to have me declared incompetent for your convenience. The silence that followed was complete except for the clock and the distant sound of the lake lapping against the dock. Dr. Foster closed her tablet. I think perhaps I should go. That might be best, I agreed. This was never a medical consultation anyway, was it? This was a sales presentation for a decision that had already been made without me. As she gathered her things, David finally spoke. Dad, we can fix this. If you're upset about the letter, about the way we approach this. Upset? I looked at my son, this stranger in an expensive suit who'd measured my worth in terms of real estate values and legal vulnerabilities. David, I'm not upset. I'm disappointed. And there's a difference between those two things that I hope you'll understand someday. I walked to the window that overlooked the lake, the same view I'd shared with Margaret for 37 years. Your mother used to say that a man's true character shows when he thinks no one is watching. She was right about that, just like she was right about most things. When I turned back, they were all standing, gathering purses and coats with the hurried efficiency of people fleeing a crime scene. The roast will be ready in 10 minutes, I said. You're welcome to stay for dinner, but if you do, we're going to eat as a family, not as adversaries. And we're going to talk about memory. The good ones, the ones worth keeping. David paused at the door. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, the one who'd help me in the garden and ask endless questions about how things worked. "Dad, I never meant—" "Yes, you did," I said gently. "You meant exactly what you wrote in that letter. The question now is whether that's the man you want to be." They left without dinner, their footsteps echoing on the porch boards Margaret and I had laid together the summer David turned 16. I watched their taillights disappear down the driveway, then returned to the kitchen to turn off the oven. The roast would keep. Tomorrow, I'd make sandwiches and take them down to the dock, sit in the same chair where Margaret used to read her mysteries, and think about the difference between being alone and being lonely. Tonight, I was alone. But for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't lonely. I was home, in a house that was still mine, surrounded by memories that no one could take away, holding documents that proved an old man could still surprise the people who thought they had him figured out. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, marking the hour when my family dinner should have been ending with coffee and conversation. Instead, it marked the beginning of a different kind of evening, one where the only voice I needed to answer to was my own. The silence after their departure settled around me like snow, thick and insulating. I stood in the dining room, looking at the table still set for 6, Margaret's good china catching the last light from the windows. The roast sat cooling in the kitchen, filling the house with the smell of a meal no one would eat. A gathering that had turned into something else entirely. I began clearing the table slowly, each plate a small meditation on the evening that had just passed. Sarah's place setting, barely touched. Dr. Foster's spot, where she'd sat taking notes about my supposed decline while occupying my wife's chair. David's plate, which he'd abandoned the moment I'd produced that manila folder. In the kitchen, I wrapped the roast in foil and slid it into the refrigerator. Margaret had always said you could tell the measure of a person by what they did with abundance, whether they wasted it or found ways to make it last. The meat would make sandwiches for a week, maybe soup after that. Nothing would be wasted, despite the evening's disappointments. I poured myself a glass of the wine I'd opened for dinner, a bottle David had given me for my birthday 3 years ago, back when gift-giving still felt like love instead of obligation. The irony wasn't lost on me as I carried it to the living room and settled into my chair, the worn leather recliner that had molded to my body over the decades. The manila folder lay where I'd left it on the coffee table, its contents scattered like evidence at a crime scene. But alongside David's treacherous correspondence were my own documents, the new will, the healthcare directive, the trust agreement, proof that a 73-year-old man still had agency, still had choices, still had the capacity to protect himself when his own family wouldn't. I thought about calling Margaret's sister Ruth, who lived in Phoenix now, and sent Christmas cards with long letters about her grandchildren's achievements. But Ruth had never really understood David, had always thought Margaret and I were too soft with him, too willing to excuse his ambitions as natural competitiveness. "That boy takes more than he gives," she'd said once, years ago, and Margaret had defended him with the fierce loyalty of a mother who sees potential in every flaw. Maybe Ruth had been right. Maybe we'd raised David to expect that love meant never having to justify your actions, never having to consider the cost of your desires on other people's lives. I walked through the house as the evening light faded, stopping in each room to remember. The living room where David had built pillow forts as a child, where he'd practiced piano reluctantly until he turned 16 and declared music a waste of time. The hallway where we'd marked his height on the doorframe every birthday until he'd grown too tall and too self-conscious to participate in such childish rituals. His old bedroom, which I'd left mostly unchanged except for converting part of it into Margaret's sewing room. His high school trophies still lined one shelf, not for sports, which he'd dismissed as brutish, but for academic competitions. Math league, debate team, mock trial, all victories that required defeating someone else, proving yourself superior through someone else's failure. Margaret had been so proud of those trophies. "He's going to be somebody important," she'd say, polishing them with the same care she gave her good china. "He's going to make a difference in the world." I suppose he had become somebody important. A successful attorney with a corner office and expensive suits, and a wife who photographed other people's homes like they were inventory to be appraised. But the kind of difference he was making, well, that remained to be seen. In the master bedroom, I sat on my side of the bed and looked at Margaret's photograph on the nightstand. It was taken the summer before her diagnosis, at the lake house we'd bought as a family retreat. She was laughing at something David had said, her hair caught by the wind, her eyes bright with the kind of happiness that comes from being surrounded by people you love without reservation. "What would you tell me to do?" I asked her image. "How do I love a son who sees me as an obstacle instead of a father?" But I knew what Margaret would say. She'd always believed in redemption, in the possibility that people could recognize their mistakes and choose to do better. Even at the end, when the cancer had stolen her strength but not her hope, she'd made me promise to be patient with David, to remember that grief made people act in ways they didn't mean. "He's hurting too," she'd whispered during one of those last hospital nights. "He just doesn't know how to show it without making it about something else. Making it about something else, like turning concern into control, love into legal maneuvering, inheritance into entitlement." I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the small wooden box where I kept Margaret's wedding ring, the one she'd asked me to remove when her fingers became too thin to hold it. Inside the box was also a folded piece of paper, her last letter to me, written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose body was failing, but whose mind remained clear. "My dearest William," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're learning how to live without me. I know how hard that will be, because I can't imagine living without you either, but I need you to promise me something. Don't let grief make you smaller. Don't let loneliness make you compromise who you are. And don't let anyone, not even David, convince you that needing help is the same as giving up control." She'd known. Somehow, even while fighting for her life, she'd seen what might happen, had understood that David's way of processing loss might involve trying to fix things that weren't broken, trying to solve problems that didn't exist. "David loves you," the letter continued, "but he loves the idea of being helpful more than he loves the reality of letting you be yourself. That's not malice, sweetheart. That's fear. He's afraid of losing you the way we're losing each other, and he thinks if he can just manage everything perfectly, he can keep that from happening." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. Margaret had always been wiser than me, better at reading people's motivations, more patient with their flaws. But even her wisdom had its limits. There was a difference between being afraid of loss and actively hastening it, between wanting to help and deciding to take over. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed David's number. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello, David?" "Dad." His voice was different now, smaller somehow, stripped of the professional confidence he'd worn like armor during dinner. "I wanted to call and we need to talk. We just talked for 2 hours. That wasn't talking. That was..." He paused, searching for words. "I don't know what that was." "That was honesty," I said. "Something we haven't tried in a while." A long silence stretched between us, filled with all the conversations we hadn't had, all the assumptions we'd both made about what the other person wanted. "Dad, I never meant for you to feel ambushed. The letter you found, the things I wrote about you, I was just trying to build a case for what I thought was best for your future, without consulting me about what I thought was best for my future, because I didn't think you'd be objective about it." The admission hung between us like a confession. He didn't think I was capable of making good decisions about my own life, not because of any evidence of incompetence, but because he'd decided that his judgment was superior to mine. "David," I said gently, "when you were 16, you wanted to drop out of high school and start a computer business. Do you remember what I told you? You said I was too young to make that kind of decision. And do you remember what you said to me?" Another pause. "I said it was my life, and I should get to choose what to do with it. And what did I do? You listened. You asked questions about my business plan, about how I'd handle the competition, about what I'd do if it failed. And then you helped me research community college programs that would let me study business while still finishing high school. I respected your right to make choices about your own life, even when I thought those choices might be mistakes, even when I was afraid for you." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, the sound of a man realizing that the principles he'd once demanded for himself were the same ones he was now denying to his father. "This is different," he said finally. "You're older now, more vulnerable." "I'm not more vulnerable, David. I'm more experienced. There's a difference. But what if something happens? What if you fall or get sick or..." Then I'll handle it the same way I've handled everything else for the past 73 years, by making the best decisions I can with the information I have. And what if those decisions are wrong? I looked around the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret for 37 years, at the house I'd built with my own hands, at the life I'd constructed through decades of choices both good and bad. Then there'll be my wrong decisions, I said, and I'll live with the consequences, or I won't, but they'll be mine. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, less hostile, more thoughtful. "I'm scared, Dad," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of losing you the way we lost Mom. And I thought if I could just control all the variables, I could keep that from happening." There it was. The truth that had been hiding behind all the legal maneuvering and professional consultations and talk of appropriate facilities. My son wasn't trying to steal my life. He was trying to preserve it in the only way he knew how. By taking charge, by making decisions, by turning love into a management strategy. "David," I said, "you can't save me from dying. Nobody can. But you can save our relationship from dying, if you want to." "How?" I thought about Margaret's letter, about her faith in redemption and second chances, about the difference between helping someone and controlling them, between love and management. "By trusting me to live my own life, even if you don't agree with all my choices. By visiting because you want to see me, not because you need to check on me. By asking what I need instead of deciding what I should want. And if I can't do that, if I can't stop worrying, then worry," I said. "But worry like a son, not like a caretaker. There's a difference." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness for a long time. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, then 10. Outside, the lake reflected the first stars, constant and patient in the way that water teaches you to be. I didn't know if tonight's conversation would change anything. David had spent years learning to manage problems by controlling them, and old habits die hard. But for the first time since I'd found that letter, I felt something other than anger or disappointment. I felt hope, not the naive hope that everything would go back to the way it was, but the harder, more realistic hope that we might find a way forward that honored both his fear and my independence. Tomorrow, I would call Marcus Chen and ask him to hold off on finalizing the new will. Not because I was changing my mind about protecting myself, but because I wanted to give David a chance to earn back what he'd almost lost. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure that had weathered decades of storms and still stood strong. Like love, I thought, like family when it's built on the right foundation, like the possibility that even when trust is broken, it can sometimes be repaired, if both people are willing to do the work. 3 weeks passed in a kind of careful silence. David called twice, both conversations awkward and formal, like negotiations between countries that had recently been at war. We talked about the weather, about his work, about anything except the evening that had changed everything between us. Sarah didn't call at all, which was probably for the best. I fell into a routine that felt like recovery. Morning coffee at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper cover to cover the way Margaret used to insist, was necessary for staying connected to the world. Afternoons working in the garden, preparing the beds for winter, cutting back the rose bushes Margaret had babied through 15 summers. Evenings in my chair, reading or watching the news, sometimes talking to her photograph about the small details of the day. It wasn't a bad life, quiet maybe, but not empty. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed my own company, how restful it could be to move through a house without having to explain yourself to anyone. But on a gray Thursday morning in early November, that peace was shattered by a phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Williams, this is Janet Morrison from First National Bank." The woman's voice was professional, but tinged with something that sounded like concern. "I'm calling about some unusual activity on your accounts." I set down my coffee cup with hands that had suddenly gone unsteady. "What kind of activity?" "Well, sir, we've received several inquiries about your financial status over the past 2 weeks. Phone calls asking about account balances, loan applications, estate planning documents. The inquiries came from someone claiming to be your son, but they weren't able to provide proper authorization." My stomach dropped. "David Ethan Williams? That's the name that was given, yes. Sir, I want to assure you that no information was released without proper documentation, but I thought you should know that someone has been asking questions." After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. The careful détente I'd been building with David, the hope that we might find our way back to each other. It crumbled like paper in rain. He hadn't changed at all. If anything, he'd become more determined, more willing to go behind my back to get what he wanted. The second call came an hour later, from Dr. Patricia Hendricks, my physician for the past 15 years. "Bill, I had a strange call yesterday from someone claiming to be your son. He was asking about your medical records, specifically about any cognitive decline or memory issues." Her voice carried the mild outrage of a professional whose ethics had been challenged. "Of course, I told him I couldn't discuss your health with anyone without your written consent, but I thought you should know." "What exactly did he want to know?" "He was asking about medications that might affect mental clarity, about any diagnoses related to dementia or Alzheimer's. He seemed particularly interested in whether I'd recommend psychiatric evaluation for someone exhibiting signs of paranoia or irrational behavior." Paranoia, irrational behavior. David was building a medical case now, shopping for a doctor who might give him the diagnosis he needed to proceed with guardianship proceedings. "Dr. Hendricks, I need you to document this call. Put a note in my file that any requests for medical information should be directed to me personally, regardless of who's asking." "Already done, Bill, and for what it's worth, you're one of the sharpest patients I have. Whatever's going on with your family, it's not about your mental capacity." The third call came that afternoon, from Ellen Foster at the county clerk's office. Ellen had been a classmate of Margaret's in high school, and she'd handled the paperwork when we'd bought the lake house 30 years ago. "Bill, honey, I probably shouldn't be calling you about this, but I thought you'd want to know. Your son was here yesterday asking about property records, specifically about how to challenge the mental competency of someone listed on a deed." The room spun slightly. "He was asking about my house? He didn't mention you by name, but he was looking at your property file when he asked the questions. Bill, he also inquired about the process for emergency conservatorship, the kind they use when someone is declared in immediate danger to themselves. Emergency conservatorship, the kind of legal maneuver that could have me removed from my home within days, based on nothing more than a doctor's signature and a judge's rubber stamp. That evening, I called Marcus Chen. "Mr. Williams, I was hoping to hear from you soon." His voice carried a grim satisfaction. "I've been getting some interesting calls myself. Your son has been contact shopping, calling law firms, asking about expedited guardianship proceedings, inquiring about what kind of evidence he'd need to have you declared incompetent." "How many firms has he called?" "At least 6 that I know of. Most of them referred him elsewhere when they realized what he was trying to do. But, Bill, there are lawyers out there who specialize in these kinds of cases, lawyers who know how to make elderly people disappear into the system." I closed my eyes and thought about Sunrise Manor, about beige hallways and mandatory meal times and activities designed to keep old people busy until they died, about losing the right to make decisions about my own life, my own body, my own future. What can we do? We accelerate our timeline, the trust documents, the new will, the healthcare directives. We finalize everything immediately, and we document every one of these contact attempts as evidence of harassment and potential elder abuse. Elder abuse? Using false information to manipulate financial institutions and medical professionals constitutes a form of abuse, yes. Your son is systematically attempting to undermine your autonomy. That's not love, Mr. Williams. That's control. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, touching surfaces Margaret and I had chosen together, looking at photographs that spanned 4 decades of marriage. In David's old room, I opened his closet and found boxes of childhood memories I'd been unable to throw away. Model airplanes he'd built with painstaking care, science fair projects that had won ribbons, the leather-bound journal where he'd written his first short stories, tales of adventure and heroism where good always triumphed over evil. When had he stopped being the hero of his own story? When had he decided that the ends justified any means, that love was just another word for getting your way? I found myself thinking about Margaret's funeral, about the way David had taken charge of everything, the flowers, the service, the reception afterward. At the time, I'd been grateful for his efficiency, his ability to handle details when I was too broken to think clearly. But now, I wondered if that had been the beginning, the moment when he decided I was too fragile to be trusted with important decisions. Friday morning brought a call from Sarah. Her voice was different. Not the carefully modulated politeness I'd grown accustomed to, but something rawer, more urgent. "William, we need to talk. Not on the phone. Can I come see you?" "Of course. When?" "Now. I'm already on my way." She arrived 20 minutes later, driving David's BMW and looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore jeans and a sweater instead of her typical designer armor. I made coffee while she paced in the kitchen, her nervous energy filling the room like static electricity. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, accepting the mug with hands that trembled slightly. "About David. About what he's been doing." "I already know about the phone calls, Sarah. The bank, my doctor, the county clerk. It's more than that." She sat down heavily, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. "He's been meeting with lawyers, real estate agents, even a private investigator." "A private investigator?" "He hired someone to look into your daily routine, to document any behavior that might be considered concerning. The man's been watching you, William, taking photographs, making notes about when you go grocery shopping, how long you spend in each store, whether you seem confused or disoriented." The violation felt physical, like being punched in the stomach. "How long has this been going on?" 2 weeks, maybe more." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug as if trying to draw warmth from it. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know until yesterday. I found the reports in his office at home." "What did they say?" Sarah's laugh was bitter, broken. "That you're a man living alone who maintains his property, pays his bills on time, and has normal social interactions with neighbors and service providers. In other words, that you're completely competent and independent. Then why?" "Because it doesn't matter what the reports say. David's already decided what he wants the truth to be. He told the investigator to keep looking, to document anything that could be interpreted as concerning behavior, talking to yourself in the garden, spending too much time looking at photographs, eating the same breakfast every morning." I thought about the simple routines that had become my comfort after Margaret's death, the way I sometimes spoke to her picture while making dinner, the ritual of reading the newspaper in the same order every day, the habit of checking the locks twice before bed. Normal behaviors for a man learning to live alone, now twisted into evidence of decline. "Sarah, why are you telling me this?" She looked up at me with eyes that held something I'd never seen there before, shame mixed with a kind of desperate honesty. "Because I can't be part of this anymore. Because what he's doing to you is wrong, and I've been wrong to go along with it." She paused, gathering herself. "And because there's something else you need to know, about why he's so desperate to get control of your assets." The way she said it made my chest tighten. "What do you mean?" "David's law firm is in trouble, bad trouble. They made some investments that went sideways, took on cases they couldn't afford to lose, borrowed money against future settlements that didn't materialize." She met my eyes directly. "We're broke, William. Worse than broke. We owe money to people who don't accept payment plans." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. The expensive car, the designer clothes, the perfect house in the perfect neighborhood, all of it built on debt that was coming due. David wasn't trying to protect me from decline. He was trying to access my assets to save himself from financial ruin. "How much do you owe?" "Enough that your house would solve the problem. Enough that David's willing to have his own father declared incompetent to get his hands on it." I set down my coffee cup and walked to the window overlooking the lake. The water was gray under the November sky, choppy with wind. It looked cold, unforgiving, the way truth often does when you're finally ready to see it clearly. "What will you do now?" I asked without turning around. "I'm leaving him. I should have left months ago when this first started, but I was scared. Scared of being alone, scared of starting over." Her voice strengthened. "But I'm more scared of what I'll become if I stay with someone who could do this to his own father." When I turned back, she was standing, purse in hand, keys already out. "Yes, Sarah," I said, "thank you for telling me, for choosing to do the right thing, even when it cost you something." She nodded, tears starting to fall. "I'm sorry, William. I'm so sorry for all of it." After she left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, processing what I'd learned. David wasn't just misguided or overly protective. He was desperate, backed into a corner by his own bad decisions, willing to destroy his father to save himself. It was time to stop playing defense. Time to remind my son that a man doesn't become helpless just because he's grieving, and that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. I reached for the phone to call Marcus Chen. We had work to do, and not much time to do it. The war I'd been trying to avoid was already here. Now it was time to make sure I won it. Marcus Chen's office felt different on a Friday afternoon in November. The autumn light slanted through his windows with the sharp clarity that comes before winter, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny witnesses to the conversation we were about to have. I sat across from his desk, with Sarah's revelations still burning in my chest, and the manila folder of evidence I'd been collecting spread between us like a battle plan. "Mr. Williams," Marcus said, reviewing the notes I'd brought him, "what your daughter-in-law has told you changes everything. This isn't about family dynamics anymore. This is about financial fraud and elder abuse." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the way men do when they're calculating odds and finding them favorable. "The private investigator, the false inquiries to your bank and doctor, the attempts to find complicit attorneys. Your son has crossed several legal lines, but more importantly for our purposes, he's shown his hand." "What do you mean?" "He's operating under time pressure now. Desperate people make mistakes, and desperate people can be baited into making bigger mistakes." Marcus pulled out a fresh legal pad and began sketching what looked like a flow chart. "We know he needs your assets to solve his financial problems. We know he's been gathering what he thinks is evidence of your incompetence. The question is, how do we use that knowledge to protect you and expose him?" I thought about David as a child, the way he'd approach complex puzzles, methodically, systematically, always convinced that if he just gathered enough information, he could control the outcome. That same trait that had made him an excellent student had apparently made him a dangerous adversary. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was talking to someone who enjoyed strategic thinking as much as my son did. "We're going to give him exactly what he thinks he wants. We're going to let him believe he's winning, right up until the moment we show him, and everyone else, exactly what kind of man he's become." The plan Marcus outlined was elegant in its simplicity. Over the next 2 weeks, we would create a series of carefully orchestrated situations designed to document David's true intentions. A fake medical emergency that would reveal how quickly he'd move to assume control. A staged incident of confusion that would show how he'd exploit any perceived weakness. And finally, a family gathering where he'd be invited to present his case for guardianship in front of witnesses who could testify to his real motivations. "The key," Marcus explained, "is that everything has to be his idea. He has to believe he's manipulating the situation, not responding to our manipulation of him." I left his office with a strange mixture of anticipation and sadness. The boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I'd helped through law school, the son I'd been so proud of. That person was about to be exposed as someone willing to sacrifice his father's freedom for his own financial survival. Part of me still hoped we were wrong, that when confronted with the reality of what he was doing, David would step back and remember who he used to be. But the larger part of me knew better. Some lines, once crossed, change you forever. Some choices reveal character rather than create it. The first phase began the following Monday. I called David's office and left a message with his secretary, my voice deliberately shaky and confused. "Tell him his father called. Tell him I think I might have forgotten to pay the electric bill, and I can't remember if I took my medication this morning. Ask him to call me back when he has time." David called within an hour. "Dad, what's wrong? You sound upset." "I'm just confused about some things," I said, letting uncertainty creep into my voice. "The bills are all mixed up on my desk, and I can't remember what I've paid and what I haven't. And this morning, I found my pills scattered on the bathroom counter, but I don't remember dropping them." The silence on his end was telling, not concern, but calculation. I could almost hear the gears turning as he processed this information and began planning how to use it. "Dad, maybe I should come over this evening, help you sort through the bills, make sure everything's organized. Would you? That would be such a relief. I don't know what's wrong with me lately." "Don't worry about it. We all have days like that. I'll be there around 6. He arrived early at 5:30, with Sarah noticeably absent. He moved through my house with the efficiency of a man conducting an inventory, photographing the bills spread across my desk, taking note of the prescription bottles I deliberately left scattered in the bathroom. He was building a case, collecting evidence, documenting what he believed was my deterioration. "Dad, these bills are a mess," he said, sorting through papers with practiced authority. "Look, you've got 3 notices from the electric company here, and this credit card statement shows some unusual purchases. Did you really spend $300 at the hardware store last week?" "I don't remember," I said, though I remembered perfectly well. I'd bought materials to repair the dock, the same kind of maintenance I'd been doing for 30 years. "Maybe I did. Everything seems foggy lately." David made notes on his phone, probably recording my supposed confusion for future reference. When he found the bottle of blood pressure medication with pills scattered beside it, his eyes lit up with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "Dad, you can't be careless with your medication. Missing doses could cause serious problems." I know. I just can't seem to keep track anymore." By the time he left, David had photographed my disorganized bills, documented my medication confusion, and made a list of repairs he claimed the house needed. Repairs I'd already completed but had temporarily undone for his benefit. He'd also asked several leading questions about my memory, my sleep patterns, and my ability to manage daily tasks. Most tellingly, he'd suggested that I might want to consider getting some help around the house, and had left me with the business card of a care management service that specialized in elderly clients who needed assistance with daily living activities. The second phase came 3 days later, when I called David in the middle of the night, claiming I'd heard noises outside and couldn't remember if I'd locked the doors. I made myself sound frightened, disoriented, asking him to come check the house because I was too scared to look for myself. He arrived within 30 minutes, bringing his phone to record our conversation. I played the role of a confused, frightened old man, while he documented my paranoia and inability to distinguish between real and imagined threats. He spent an hour walking through the house, checking locks and windows, while I followed behind him like a helpless child. "Dad, all the doors were locked. The windows are secure. There's nobody outside. But I heard footsteps on the porch. I'm sure I did." Sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially at night. Maybe you were dreaming, or maybe it was just the wind. He suggested I call him instead of investigating strange noises myself, painted my caution as fearfulness, my independence as stubbornness. By the time he left, he had enough evidence on his phone to convince any sympathetic judge that I was becoming a danger to myself. The final phase required Sarah's cooperation, which she gave freely. She called David 3 days before Thanksgiving, suggesting that her parents host a family dinner where we could all discuss Dad's future in a supportive environment. She framed it as an intervention motivated by love, a chance for the family to address my obvious decline before it became dangerous. David embraced the idea immediately. This was his moment, his opportunity to present his case in front of witnesses and get family support for his guardianship petition. He spent the next 3 days preparing documents, gathering his evidence, even consulting with a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in the competency evaluations. What he didn't know was that Sarah had been keeping me informed of every detail. The dinner was being held at the Blackwell family home, a sprawling colonial in an upscale neighborhood that spoke of old money and social position. Dr. Foster, the geriatric specialist from our first dinner, would be attending, along with a social worker named Helen Martinez, who specialized in elderly care placement. They were bringing an entire team to document my decline and recommend institutional care. It was going to be a carefully orchestrated performance designed to strip away my independence and justify taking control of my assets. I spent the 3 days before Thanksgiving finalizing my own preparations. Marcus Chen worked around the clock to complete the documentation we'd need, including recordings of David's phone calls to various financial institutions, copies of his correspondence with potential guardianship attorneys, and a detailed timeline of his deceptive behavior over the past month. Most importantly, we prepared the surprise that would turn David's triumph into his exposure. Hidden cameras had been installed in my house, with my full consent and legal documentation, capturing every moment of his evidence-gathering visits, audio recordings of his conversations with me, where he'd led me to describe confusion I wasn't experiencing and fears I didn't have, written statements from my bank, my doctor, and the county clerk documenting his attempts to access information he had no right to request. The truth, in other words. The full documented truth about what my son had been willing to do to his own father. On Thanksgiving evening, as I dressed for what David believed would be my last dinner as a free man, I thought about Margaret and what she would say about the choice I was about to make. She'd always believed in redemption, in the possibility that people could recognize their mistakes and choose differently. But she'd also believed in accountability, in the importance of consequences for choices made in selfishness rather than love. Tonight, David would have to choose between the father who'd raised him and the financial salvation he'd convinced himself he needed. Between the man he used to be and the man he'd become in pursuit of what he wanted. I straightened my tie, the same navy blue one I'd worn to his law school graduation, and picked up the briefcase containing everything Marcus and I had prepared. Tonight would end the war David had started, one way or another. The truth was going to set someone free. The question was whether it would be him or me. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, and the lake reflected the last light of a day that was ending, just as another kind of day was about to begin. I locked the door behind me and walked to my truck, carrying the weight of what I was about to do like a stone in my chest. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Tonight, my son was going to learn what it meant to underestimate the man who'd taught him everything he claimed to know about strength. The Blackwell house glowed with warm light as I pulled into the circular driveway. Through the windows, I could see figures moving in the dining room, preparing for a dinner that David believed would change everything. He was right about that, at least. Everything was about to change, just not in the way he expected. The Blackwell house stood like a monument to suburban respectability, its windows glowing with a kind of warm light that suggested happy families and grateful hearts. The circular driveway curved past manicured landscaping that had been designed to impress rather than comfort, every shrub trimmed to mathematical precision. As I parked my old Ford between David's BMW and a silver Mercedes I didn't recognize, I felt like a working man arriving at a country club where he didn't belong. But that was exactly the impression they wanted to create. Tonight I was supposed to be the confused, declining patriarch being gently guided toward appropriate care by his loving, successful family. The old man who'd outlived his usefulness and needed to be managed by people who knew better. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back was 73 years old, with lines carved by decades of work and loss. But his eyes were clear and his jaw was set. Whatever happened in the next few hours, it wouldn't happen to a victim. The briefcase on the passenger seat contained everything Marcus and I had prepared. Documentation of David's deception, recordings of his manipulative phone calls, evidence of his financial desperation. The truth, organized and indexed like the construction plans I used to prepare before building a house. Every beam accounted for, every measurement verified. I picked up the briefcase and walked to the front door, my footsteps steady on the flagstone path. Before I could knock, the door opened to reveal Patricia Blackwell, resplendent in what I suspected was her Thanksgiving best. A burgundy dress that complemented her silver hair and jewelry that caught the foyer light like small stars. "William!" Her greeting was pitched to carry into the house, announcing my arrival to the assembled witnesses. "So wonderful to see you. Come in, everyone's here." Everyone. I stepped into the foyer and heard the murmur of conversation from the dining room, punctuated by David's voice explaining something in the measured tones he used when he wanted to sound reasonable and authoritative. "Let me take your coat," Patricia said, her hands already reaching for my shoulders. I noticed she avoided looking directly at the briefcase, as if it were a prop that didn't fit the evening script. "Actually, I'll keep it with me. It has some papers David asked me to bring." She paused, her smile flickering like a candle in wind. "Papers? Bills, medical records, that sort of thing. He's been so helpful lately, trying to help me get organized."
The dining room fell quiet as we entered. It was a formal space designed to intimidate, with a mahogany table that could seat 12 and a chandelier that cast dramatic shadows across the assembled faces. David sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dr. Foster, and a woman I didn't recognize but assumed was the social worker Sarah had mentioned. Robert Blackwell occupied his usual position of authority at the foot of the table, while Sarah sat to one side, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else.
"Dad." David rose to greet me, his embrace performed for the benefit of our audience. "I'm so glad you could make it. I know driving at night has been difficult for you lately. First shot fired. Driving at night had never been difficult for me, but David was establishing the narrative from the moment I walked in the door. Actually, the roads were quite clear, I said mildly, setting my briefcase beside my chair. Though I did stop to help a young woman with a flat tire about halfway here. Took me 20 minutes to get it changed, but her spare was in good shape. Dr. Foster made a note on her ever-present tablet, probably marking down my confusion about time and distance, my inappropriate involvement in roadside assistance. Everything I said would be filtered through the lens of decline and poor judgment. "Dad, you shouldn't be stopping to help strangers," David said, his concern theatrical in its intensity. "What if something had happened? What if you'd been hurt? Then I suppose I'd have dealt with it, the way I've dealt with everything else for the past 7 decades. Robert Blackwell cleared his throat, assuming his role as family patriarch. "William, we're all concerned about you. Living alone in that big house, so far from medical facilities, trying to manage everything by yourself. It's admirable, but perhaps not practical anymore. I appreciate your concern, Robert, though I'm curious about when it developed. We've known each other for 8 years, and this is the first time you've expressed interest in my living arrangements." An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Sarah stared at her hands while Patricia busied herself, adjusting the silverware that was already perfectly aligned. Dr. Foster leaned forward with practiced empathy. "Mr. Williams, I understand this must feel overwhelming. Change is difficult at any age, but especially when we're dealing with the natural transitions of aging. No one here wants to take away your independence. We simply want to ensure you have the support you need." Support for what, specifically? She consulted her tablet, reading from notes that could only have come from David. "Your son has shared some concerns about recent episodes of confusion, difficulty managing medications, problems with bill paying and household maintenance." "Episodes," I repeated. "That's an interesting word choice. Makes it sound medical, doesn't it? Clinical. David, would you like to tell everyone about these episodes?" My son's face had taken on the careful blankness he'd perfected in the courtrooms, revealing nothing of what he was thinking or feeling. "Dad, we don't need to go through all the details." "Oh, but I think we do. Dr. Foster, you mentioned medication problems. David, can you be more specific about what you observed?" He shifted in his chair, suddenly less comfortable in his role as concerned son. "You had pills scattered on your bathroom counter. You couldn't remember if you'd taken your morning dose." "I see. And how did you happen to observe this?" "When I came to help you with your bills last week. The bills I had asked you to help me organize because I was confused about what I'd paid and what I hadn't." "Yes. David, do you remember what those bills were for?" Another pause, longer this time. "Utilities, credit cards, the usual things." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the table like a card player, revealing his hand. "These are copies of my bank statements for the past 6 months. Every bill paid on time, every transaction recorded, every account balanced to the penny. Would you like to explain to everyone how a man who can't manage his bills maintains perfect financial records?" Dr. Foster's pen stopped moving. Robert Blackwell leaned forward to get a better look at the papers I'd spread across the table. "And the scattered medication," I continued, pulling out another document. "Here's a letter from my pharmacist, dated yesterday, confirming that I've never missed a prescription pickup, never requested early refills due to lost medication, and have consistently demonstrated proper medication management for the past 5 years." David's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "Dad, you're obviously having a good day today, but that doesn't mean a good day. Yes, I suppose it is a good day. A day for clarity." I reached into the briefcase again, this time pulling out a small digital recorder. "David, do you remember our conversation last Monday night when I called you about hearing noises outside my house? You were frightened, confused. You couldn't tell the difference between real sounds and what did I actually hear?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing too late that he was walking into a trap. I pressed play on the recorder. My voice filled the dining room, and everyone could hear exactly what I'd said that night. Clear, coherent descriptions of specific sounds, reasonable requests for help checking the property, rational responses to David's questions. What they also heard was David leading me toward expressions of confusion and fear, suggesting interpretations of my words that I'd never intended. "That's illegal," David said, his lawyer's instincts finally kicking in. "You can't record someone without their consent. Actually, in this state, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. I consented. To recording conversations in my own home, about my own mental state, with people who claim to be concerned about my welfare. I pulled out another recorder, then another. Monday night's call, your visit to help with my bills, our conversation about medication confusion, all of it recorded, all of it demonstrating exactly how you coach me to sound confused and incapable. The silence in the room was deafening. Dr. Foster had stopped taking notes entirely. Helen Martinez, the social worker, was staring at David with something approaching disgust. Even Robert Blackwell looked like he was reconsidering his position in this particular battle. But I wasn't finished. "Sarah," I said, turning to my daughter-in-law, "would you like to tell everyone about David's financial situation? About why he's so concerned about my ability to manage my own assets?" Sarah looked at her husband with eyes that held no sympathy, no support, just the flat disappointment of someone who'd finally seen enough. "David's law firm is bankrupt. They owe money to clients, to creditors, to people who don't accept excuses. He needs Williams' assets to avoid criminal charges for misappropriation of client funds." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock across every face except mine. Patricia gasped. Robert's expression shifted from confusion to anger. Dr. Foster actually dropped her pen. David was on his feet now, his careful composure completely shattered. You don't understand the complexities of law firm financing." "I understand theft," I said quietly. "I understand fraud. I understand a son who would sacrifice his father's freedom to solve his own problems." I stood and began collecting my papers, sliding them back into the briefcase with methodical precision. "Dr. Foster, you've been presented with fabricated evidence of mental decline to support a guardianship petition that would give my son control of assets he needs to avoid prosecution. Ms. Martinez, you've been asked to recommend institutional care for a man who is perfectly capable of independent living. You've both been used as unwitting accomplices in what amounts to elder abuse." Dr. Foster found her voice first. "Mr. Williams, I had no idea. If I'd known the information was false..." "You couldn't have known. David is an excellent lawyer, skilled at presenting partial truths in ways that support his desired outcome. Unfortunately, he's chosen to use those skills against his own father." I turned to face David directly. This stranger wearing my son's face. This man who'd been willing to steal my freedom to solve his own problems. "You want to know about memory, David? I remember teaching you to ride a bicycle in the driveway of our first house. I remember staying up all night with you when you had pneumonia at age 8. I remember the pride in your mother's voice when you graduated law school, when you passed the bar, when you married Sarah. I remember the man I thought I was raising. My voice was steady, but something in my chest was breaking with each word. What I don't remember is raising a son who would lie about his father's mental state to steal his inheritance. What I don't remember is teaching you that love means control, that family means ownership, that desperation justifies any betrayal." David's mouth worked soundlessly, his face cycling through anger, shame, and something that might have been recognition of what he'd become. "I've prepared new estate documents," I continued, pulling out one final set of papers. "My house, my assets, my medical decisions. They're all now protected by legal structures you can't manipulate or challenge. You'll receive a modest inheritance when I die, enough to demonstrate that I haven't disinherited you out of spite, but you'll never again have the power to make decisions about my life." I closed the briefcase and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "There will be no guardianship proceedings, no forced relocation, no institutional care. I'll live in my own house, making my own decisions for as long as I'm able. And when I'm not able anymore, professionals who don't benefit from my incapacity will make those determinations." Patricia Blackwell found her voice at last. "William, surely we can work this out. Family differences can be resolved." "Mrs. Blackwell, this isn't a family difference. This is attempted fraud. This is a son who decided his father was worth more dead than alive, and who was willing to bury him institutionally to access his assets." I looked at David one last time. This man who'd once been my greatest pride and was now my deepest disappointment. You've made your choice, son. You chose money over love, control over respect, your convenience over my dignity. I hope it was worth it because it's cost you the only family you had left. The front door closed behind me with a solid finality that echoed across the Blackwells' perfect lawn. As I walked to my truck, I could hear raised voices from the dining room, David trying to explain, Sarah's voice cutting through his excuses, Robert Blackwell demanding to know what kind of liability they'd exposed themselves to by participating in this charade. I drove home through the November darkness, past the spot where I'd actually stopped to help a stranded motorist earlier, past the familiar landmarks that marked the boundary between their world and mine. The lake house appeared in my headlights like a promise kept, its windows dark but welcoming, its familiar silhouette unchanged by the evening's revelations. Inside, I hung my coat in the hall closet and set the briefcase on the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of wind across the lake. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Margaret's chair by the window, looking out at water that reflected the first stars. Tomorrow, David would have to face the consequences of his choices. His law firm, his marriage, his professional reputation, all of it built on foundations that wouldn't survive the kind of scrutiny tonight's exposure would bring. But tonight, I was home, in a house that was still mine, surrounded by memories that no one could take away, holding the dignity that I'd fought to preserve. I raised my teacup to the empty room, to endings that felt like beginnings, to the difference between being alone and being lonely. "Well, Margaret," I said to her photograph on the side table, "I kept my promise. I didn't let them make me smaller." The grandfather clock chimed 11 times, marking the end of a day that had changed everything and nothing. My son was gone, perhaps forever. But the man who'd raised him, the man who'd built this house and this life with his own hands, remained. And that, I thought, was enough. The days following Thanksgiving passed like scenes from a life I was learning to live all over again. Not the awkward relearning of widowhood, but something different. The strange peace that comes when you stop waiting for a phone call that isn't going to come. Stop hoping for an apology that will never arrive. I fell into new rhythms. Morning coffee without checking my phone for messages. Afternoon walks around the lake without wondering if David might drive up the driveway. Evening meals eaten slowly, thoughtfully, with the kind of attention you can only give when you're not listening for interruptions. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. On the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, Marcus Chen called with updates I'd been expecting but dreading to hear. "The fallout from Thursday night has been significant," he said in his careful way. "Dr. Foster has filed a complaint with the state medical board about being used to support fraudulent competency claims. The social worker, Ms. Martinez, has reported the incident to Adult Protective Services as suspected elder abuse." I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled into my chair by the window. "And David? His law firm is under investigation by the State Bar Association. Apparently, Sarah's revelations about their financial situation prompted several clients to demand audits of their escrow accounts." Marcus paused. "William, there's talk of criminal charges, embezzlement, fraud, possibly conspiracy to commit elder abuse." I should have felt satisfaction at this news, some sense of justice being served. Instead, I felt only a hollow sadness for the man my son had become, for the life he'd destroyed in pursuit of easy solutions to problems he'd created himself. "What about Sarah?" "She's filed for divorce. From what I understand, she's cooperating fully with the investigation. She's also asked me to give you this." He read from what sounded like a formal letter. "Please tell William that I'm sorry for my part in this betrayal. I should have stopped it earlier, should have found the courage to speak up before it went so far. I hope someday he can forgive me for being a coward when he needed someone to be brave." I set down my coffee cup and looked out at the lake, where the morning mist was just beginning to lift. Forgiveness was a complicated thing. Sarah had participated in David's scheme, had sat silent while plans were made to strip away my independence. But in the end, she'd chosen truth over loyalty, courage over convenience. That had to count for something. "Tell her she's forgiven," I said, "and that choosing to do the right thing, even late, still matters." The investigation unfolded over the following weeks like a slow-motion avalanche. Local newspapers picked up the story. Prominent attorney accused of elder abuse scheme. And suddenly I found myself the subject of sympathetic attention I didn't want. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and concerned inquiries. The mailman lingered to ask how I was holding up. Even the grocery store clerk treated me with the careful gentleness usually reserved for recent widowers or cancer patients. I appreciated the kindness, but I didn't want to become the neighborhood victim, the poor old man whose son had tried to steal his life. So I began venturing out more, taking longer drives, visiting places Margaret and I had discovered together during our decades of exploring the countryside around the lake. On a cold December morning, I drove to the Veterans Cemetery where my father was buried. He'd served in Korea, come home to work 40 years in a factory, raised 3 children on wages that never quite stretched far enough. He'd been a quiet man, steady as bedrock, who taught me that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he accumulated, but by what he built with his own hands. I stood beside his headstone in the winter wind, thinking about the lessons he'd tried to pass down and wondering if I'd failed to pass them on to David. Had I given my son too much, made life too easy, shielded him from the kind of consequences that teach character? "I don't know where I went wrong, Dad," I said to the simple granite marker. "I thought I was giving him opportunities you never had. Maybe I gave him too many." The wind carried the sound of geese overhead, flying south in their perfect V formation. They knew where they were going without maps or discussions, guided by instincts older than doubt. That afternoon, I called Ruth, Margaret's sister in Phoenix. We hadn't spoken since the funeral, our relationship reduced to Christmas cards and brief updates on health and weather. But suddenly, I needed to hear the voice of someone who'd known Margaret before she was my wife, who could remember the woman I'd fallen in love with without the filter of my own loss. "Bill!" Ruth's voice carried the warmth of genuine surprise. "How are you, honey? I've been thinking about you, especially around the holidays." I told her everything, about David's betrayal, about the investigation, about the strange emptiness and unexpected peace of living without the fear that had dominated my autumn. Ruth listened without interrupting, the way Margaret used to do when I needed to work through a problem out loud. "You know," she said when I finished, "Margaret worried about this. About David? About you giving too much and asking too little in return. She used to say you'd spoiled that boy without meaning to, that you'd made his life so comfortable he'd never learn to struggle for anything important." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth. Why didn't she say anything to me? Because she loved you both too much to want to hurt either of you, and because she kept hoping David would grow out of it, that marriage or fatherhood or just getting older would teach him what you couldn't. I thought about David's childhood, about birthday parties where he'd received everything on his wish list, about college tuition paid without question, about the down payment I'd provided for his first house. At the time, each gift had felt like love made tangible, proof that I could give my son opportunities I'd never had. Now I wondered if those gifts had been more about my need to provide than his need to receive. "Ruth, how do I live with knowing I helped create the man who tried to steal my life? The same way you live with knowing you raised a son who had choices and made the wrong ones. Bill, you can't take responsibility for what David became. You can only take responsibility for what you do now. What I did now was learn to live alone without being lonely. Christmas came and went quietly, just me and a small tree Margaret had always insisted on, decorated with ornaments that carried 4 decades of shared memories. I cooked a modest dinner and ate it while watching old movies, feeling more peaceful than I had in years. David sent a card, no note, just his signature and Sarah's, though I suspected Sarah had nothing to do with it. The card went into the fireplace unopened. New Year's Eve found me on the dock, bundled in Margaret's old quilt, watching fireworks bloom over the distant town. The lake reflected each burst of color like a mirror made of stars. At midnight, I raised a cup of coffee to the sky and made a resolution that felt like a promise, to live fully in whatever time remained, to find joy in simple things, to stop waiting for other people to give my life meaning. The investigation concluded in February with David's guilty plea to multiple charges of fraud and elder abuse. He received 2 years in prison and permanent disbarment. The local newspaper ran a small item about the sentencing, noting that the victim, me, had declined to make a statement to the court. I had nothing left to say to my son, nothing left to say about him. He'd made his choices and would live with the consequences. I had my own life to live. Spring came early that year, the lake ice breaking up in great sheets that caught the March sunlight like scattered mirrors. I spent my days working in Margaret's garden, preparing the beds she'd designed, planting flowers she'd chosen. My hands remembered the rhythm of the work, the satisfaction of coaxing beauty from soil that had seemed dead just weeks before. On a warm April morning, while I was deadheading the daffodils Margaret had planted our first spring in the house, a car pulled into my driveway. Not David's BMW, that had been repossessed months ago, but a modest sedan driven by a woman I didn't recognize. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and clothes that suggested someone who worked with her hands. She approached slowly, respectfully, like someone visiting a church. "Mr. Williams, I'm Catherine Morrison. I work with the Veterans Rehabilitation Program you donated to." I'd forgotten about the charitable donation I'd made in the heat of my anger, the one designed to ensure David could never inherit what he'd tried to steal. "Ms. Morrison, how can I help you?" "I wanted to thank you personally for your generosity. Your donation allowed us to purchase a retreat property for veterans dealing with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, a place where they can find peace while they heal." She handed me a folder of photographs, men and women in their 20s and 30s, some missing limbs, others bearing invisible wounds, all of them finding something like peace in a lakeside setting that looked remarkably like my own. "Your gift gave them this," she said simply, "a place to remember who they are beyond their trauma." I looked at the photos, at faces learning to hope again, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Pride, not in what I'd prevented David from taking, but in what I'd chosen to give. "Would you like to visit sometime?" Catherine asked. "Meet some of the people your generosity has helped?" "I'd like that very much." That evening, I sat on my dock with a cup of coffee and Margaret's photograph propped against the chair beside me. The sun was setting behind the pine trees, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere across the water, a loon called. That wild, lonely sound that Margaret had always said reminded her that some things in the world remained unchanged no matter how much else fell apart. "I think I'm going to be all right," I told her picture. "Not the same as before, not the way we planned, but all right." The grandfather clock chimed from inside the house, marking another hour in a life that had been broken and rebuilt, tested and proven stronger than I'd imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to become the man I wanted to be, rather than the man circumstances tried to make me. But tonight, sitting beside the lake that had witnessed 37 years of my marriage and 2 years of my widowhood, surrounded by the home I'd built with my own hands and defended with my own courage, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Contentment, not happiness. That was too large a word for where I was now. But contentment, the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd faced betrayal and chosen dignity, who'd been tested and not found wanting, who'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. The first stars appeared as the sky darkened, reflected in water that moved with the eternal patience of all deep things. I finished my coffee and gathered Margaret's photograph, ready to go inside and continue the business of living well. The war was over. I had won, and the victory tasted like peace. Just one word. Do you feel happy or sad?